Hello, everyone. This lecture on the new criticism is a follow-up to my first lecture in Unit 5 in English 208, the lecture I titled A Brief Introduction to Literary Theory. There were a few things that I felt I didn't cover as thoroughly in that lecture as I would have liked to, especially when it came to the whole subject of close reading and so on. So I thought I would follow this up especially with a more complete close reading of a poem than I did in that lecture. Um, Before we get started, let me point out that this recording is being made in natural light, and it happens to be a fairly cloudy day here. The sun comes and goes as the clouds move over the sun and so on. So from time to time you may see the image on your screen get darker or lighter as the case may be. I don't think that that is going to interfere with what I have to tell you. So let's get started. I want to begin by talking a little bit about what we mean by critical theory and literary theory. Let's begin with the idea of criticism. Now, criticism does not mean what we normally use it to mean, and that is finding fault with something. Now, Parker discusses this on pages 2 through 4 in your book, How to Interpret Literature. So I recommend those pages to you in particular if you are trying to understand what we mean by literary theory and what we mean by critical theory and criticism. All right, those three terms. I think Parker does a fairly decent job of explaining what they mean. Critical theory is the more general term, all right, and literary theory is a particular kind of critical theory. So what do we mean by critical theory in general? Now, let's talk about criticism first. Criticism in this context means looking at something in order to understand it better, to understand its meaning, if you will. Critical theory in general, then, is a theory of how we go about doing that, how we go about understanding something. And the something could be virtually anything. All right, I could have a critical theory of how to understand vernacular architecture. I could have a critical theory of how best to understand American sports. We have different kinds of critical theory. So we have, for example, art criticism, and there would be different theories of how to go about understanding works of art. We have film criticism, again, theories of how to go about understanding film, movies. And of course, we have literary theory. So literary theory is simply the specific branch of critical theory that applies to literature. Now, don't forget that there isn't just one theory of how to understand a work of literature. There isn't just one theory of how to interpret its meaning and so on. This is why we're studying this, because about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that, people started saying, now wait a minute, we need a more systematic way of explaining how we go about doing this thing called reading literature. And the new criticism is widely recognized as the first literary theory that really had widespread credibility and widespread application, was used in universities, English departments, and so on for about 50 years, until it finally started to get supplanted by what? It was supplanted by other theories. So there are, as I mentioned in that first lecture, there are quite a few different theories of how best to understand, interpret, find the meaning of a work of literature. We look at 6 of them in this course, and we begin with new criticism. So, and let me see. Okay, so yeah, we looked at new criticism then last time in terms of that poem by Emily Dickinson, I Dwell in Possibility. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, okay? Now, the point there was to illustrate for you the central concept in that theory that we call new criticism. What is at the heart of new criticism? If somebody came up to you in the dining hall and said, "Hey, I understand you're taking Dr. Stevens' course and you're studying new criticism, and can you tell me what that means? It sounds kind of interesting." What you would say is the most important thing to understand about new criticism is that the new critics really did a very, very careful analysis or interpretation or examination of the actual text of a work of literature. They looked at the words on the page and they paid attention to the words on the page, and they assumed that by understanding the text all by itself as a separate artifact, you could understand its meaning. And then you would say, and by the way, they call this close reading. Maybe you've heard of close reading of this, that, or the other kind of thing, all right? Well, the new critics emphasize the importance of doing a close reading of a work of literature. And that's what I was doing in that first lecture with the poem, I Dwell in Possibility. I was not doing a complete reading of that poem. What I wanted to do was simply give you some idea of what it means to do a close reading. And so I asked you in one of the exercises in this unit to look at, as a way of doing a close reading, to look at a work of literature and identify a category of details. All right? Because that would be one thing that a new critic would do. He would say, okay, what are the major details in this work of literature? Can we classify those details? Do they form a particular pattern of some sort? And so on. And that's how I was using I Dwell in Possibility. I looked at that and I said, well, look, this poem is about possibility, and it seems as though what Dickinson is doing, it doesn't seem, I mean, it's obvious that what Dickinson is doing is she's talking about possibility in terms of a house. That is what we would call her central metaphor. All right, so the house is a metaphor for possibility, and so let's look at the details that she's using. And we say, oh, okay, what she's doing here is she is looking at the various structural details of a house. She's looking at windows, doors, roofs, and so on. All right, she also looks at the visitors that come to the house and the occupation in a house, the things that people do in a house, and so on. All right, so we're looking at the categories of detail as they apply to a house. So that's what I was doing with that poem. But please, I went far short, or stopped far short, of giving you any kind of interpretation or full understanding of the meaning of the poem. And I want to kind of make up for that in this lecture by taking another Dickinson poem and doing a more complete reading of that poem to give you an idea of how the whole thing might work, okay, of completing what I didn't complete with I Dwell in Possibility. All right, so the poem in this case is another poem by Emily Dickinson. Much Madness is Divinest Sense. Okay, I'm going to get my copy here, and I'm going to invite you to get a copy for yourself that you can be reading along as we proceed. I have uploaded a copy of Much Madness to the course documents folder in Blackboard. So you can put me on pause, and while I get my copy of the poem here, you can go and download your copy from Blackboard, and then we will proceed. All right? Okay, so you're back. You have a copy of this poem, a short 8-line poem called Much Madness is Divinest Sense, or poem 620. You might remember that I said last time that Emily Dickinson did not title her poems, so her editors have assigned numbers to them. So this is poem 620 in the full collection of Dickinson's poems, and it goes like this. The first thing you do is you simply read the poem, all right? And poems are meant to be read out loud. You might remember that I've said that previously in other lectures. So here it goes. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Demur, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. All right. Now, before you do a close reading, as the new critics did, of a work of literature, you want to make sure you get all of the details right. Okay? What do the words literally mean, and so on. So I'm going to point out a couple of things here. I believe that most of the words are fairly familiar. We're going to spend some time talking about what a discerning eye is, because that word is particularly important here. But just a couple of things. The word that begins the seventh line of the poem, the word demur, D-E-M-U-R, demur, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. Demur might not be all that familiar a word for you. The most general sense is to disagree, or to take exception to. So in this particular context, it contrasts with the word assent. All right, so we go look at the line, okay, this would be line 6. Okay, assent, and you are saying assent means to agree. So demur is in contrast to that. Disagree, that is demur, okay, and you're straightway dangerous. So we got an important contrast, which is central to our understanding of the poem, obviously. So if you agree with the majority, if you assent to what the majority says, then you are considered sane. If you demur, that is, if you take exception to what the majority say, then you're considered dangerous and you're handled with a chain. Handled with a chain is an important image, and it's probably one you might not be familiar with. In the less enlightened days of medicine, and in particular the medicine that applies to mental issues and mental disorders and so on, people who were considered quote unquote crazy people, insane people, would be very often chained up if they were in one of those hospitals that used to be called insane asylums, all right, meaning, ironically enough, a safe place for insane people. Very often, if they became violent, they would simply be chained. They would be chained to the wall so that theoretically they could not hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. And as I'm sure you're familiar, there are certain mental disorders that do lead to violent behavior. Paranoid schizophrenics have been known to actually injure or even kill other people. So we know that there are certain mental disorders that do require some kind of control. And in the days before modern drugs, one way of controlling an insane person was to chain that person up. Well, why? Because that person was considered dangerous. All right, so what is Dickinson saying here? Demur from what the majority thinks is sane, you're considered dangerous, my friend, and they might chain you up. So let's go back. Okay, I've already suggested, I think, a few things about how to understand this poem. But let's take it from the top. Much madness is divinest sense. We have a contrast, don't we? Madness is actually sense. Okay, what some people would consider to be mad, all right, or most people maybe would consider to be mad, it's really divinest sense. It's divine sense. I mean, it's pure, absolute. It's from God. To the discerning eye. All right, so what is mad, that is, what might appear to be mad, to a discerning eye is not mad at all. It is actually sense. It makes sense. So that image or that idea of the discerning eye is essential to an understanding of this poem. Discernment, I'm sure you know that in general, to discern something simply means to see it. But the discerning eye doesn't simply see the object, it understands the object. First of all, if the object is not clear, if you are seeing something from a distance, for example, you're in a parking lot and you really like cars, and over there at the other end of the parking lot, maybe a couple hundred yards away, there's a really attractive car, and you're looking at it and you say, "Oh, I see that's a really attractive car," but you don't actually discern what kind of car it is, right? But you walk up, you get a little closer, right? And you discern that. You say, "Oh my goodness, that's an antique Corvette, right? That's an old Stingray. Wow." Okay? You discern it. All right? That's an act of discernment. Well, along with being able to tell what something really is the act of really understanding something. So the discerning eye can see what something really is, and it can understand what it is as well. So discernment in this particular case, let's go back. Much madness, when you look at it closely, right? When you look at that mad thing, that mad behavior, all right, or that really crazy idea, but you have the discerning eye, and when you look at it, you see, okay, I see it, and it's not really madness at all. It's really sense. Same thing then, right? Same thing with much sense, okay? Much sense is the starkest madness. Stark meaning it really stands out. You see the outlines of it very, very clearly. Well, the discerning eye can see the outlines of something. And you can see the outlines of this thing that's considered to be sensible, this idea, which is a sensible idea, or this particular object, which is a sensible object, or this behavior, oh, that's sensible behavior, all right, and so on. And the discerning eye sees, no, that's the starkest madness, all right? Okay, so we begin with this idea that there is a way of seeing things that understands them well enough to see that something that looks one way really is another way, and vice versa. Madness can look like sense, and sense can look like madness. So far, so good. All right? But then we go to the fourth line, "'tis the majority. In this as all prevail." The majority in this, what is this? Well, in this, you know, trying to determine whether something is mad or something is sensible or not. Okay, that's the this here. Well, we thought from those opening three lines, we thought that, when we look at something and we're trying to discern whether it is madness or sense, we're saying, well, that's up to the discerning eye, right? The individual eye looking at something. Okay, I look at something and I see, oh, yeah, I see that. And I have a discerning eye, and I can tell whether that behavior is mad or insane, or whether that behavior is perfectly normal or sensible. Okay, but all of a sudden, the poem takes a turn on us. It kind of switches the tables, right? It says, the majority. Oh, not the discerning eye at all. It's the majority that prevails in this. Okay. All right, so, all right. So agree, assent, all of a sudden we're talking about whether we agree or disagree. We're not talking about discernment anymore. We're talking about consensus. We're talking about coming to some kind of agreement with other people about something, right? And who are these other people? Well, it's the majority. Okay, the majority determine whether something is mad or whether something is sane. And so if you agree with the majority, all right, then you are considered sane. If you demur, you're straightway dangerous. So if the majority says, you know, it's perfectly normal behavior to walk down the street with a shoe on each foot, and you agree, yeah, that's perfectly normal behavior, then you're sane. But if you take off one shoe and walk down the street with one shoe on your left foot and no shoe on your right foot, you demur, don't you? Okay, you're considered dangerous. You're considered insane. You don't agree with the majority about how to walk down the street, how many shoes to wear. So you are handled with a chain. So you see the switch here. This becomes what some people call a crux in the poem. That is a central problem that has to be resolved. So let's talk about resolving it. How would the new critics resolve it? Well, Parker actually mentions this poem on page 19. Let me see if I can find it. He mentions this poem uh, in the context of talking about four things that were very popular among the new critics when it came to understanding literature. And those four things were ambiguity, paradox, irony, and tension. So Parker says he uses this particular poem as an example of tension, and he says tension is a suspended set of conflicting possibilities that will not settle into resolution, as in Emily Dickinson's poem, Much Madness is Divinest Sense. Okay, so there's tension here. We've got a contrast between two ideas of how you determine whether something is mad or sane. It can be the discerning eye, or it can be majority opinion. Okay? And the tension then is not resolved in the poem. So what does that give us? That gives us a second thing that the new critics were very fond of, and that's ambiguity. We've got a tension between these two ideas, and we're really not sure which idea we're supposed to accept, because the poem doesn't come right out and say, now wait a minute. Most people will say that it's the discerning eye, that determines whether something's mad. But let me tell you, okay, it's not the discerning eye. It's got to be the majority. Or they might say the opposite, right? Okay, but the poem doesn't do that. The poem switches things up on us very, very suddenly, and we don't know. We say, oh, well, this is kind of ambiguous. All right, we've got two possible meanings here to how we determine whether something is mad. So we've got tension because we've got unresolved ideas here, ideas that are pushing against each other. We have ambiguity in the meaning of the poem as a whole. We also have paradox. Paradox is another source of tension. It's also another one of those things that the new critics loved. And there's a paradox in the idea that what is mad is actually sensible, and what is sensible is actually mad. Much madness is divinest sense. It looks like a paradox, right? A contradiction in terms. Okay, something can't be mad and sensible at the same time. Either it's mad or it's not. Okay, but notice, the paradox really is resolved for the moment with that phrase, to the discerning eye. All right? To the discerning eye, the paradox is resolved. On the surface, it looks as though madness is sense, but the discerning eye can determine whether or not madness is sense. It's up to the discerning eye. So what happens then is it looks as though that paradox is resolved. Madness is sense? Nah, that's a paradox. That's a contradiction. Can't be. But the discerning eye can understand it. So we say, oh, okay, all right, okay. And then much sense would be the starkest madness, right? Okay, we say, yeah, sure. Somebody who can look at these things and see them for what they really are, absolutely. Okay? And then, as I pointed out, Dickinson comes along and says, wait a minute. Tis the majority in this as all prevail. They are the ones who prevail. Assent, that is, agree with the majority? Ah, you're sane. And so on. All right? So we've got what? We've got paradox. We've got tension. We've got ambiguity. And finally, we have irony. Isn't it ironic? All right? Isn't it ironic that something that looks mad could be sensible, and something that looks sensible could be mad? But that's not the fundamental irony here, is it? Okay? The irony is that it really is a matter of, okay, it's not a matter of really understanding what's mad and what's sensible. It's really just a matter of what the majority tells us, right? The norm, as it were. Okay? So, four things then that were very popular among the new critics: tension, ambiguity, irony, and paradox. Okay, now, that is what the new critic does when the new critic does a close reading. And you're probably saying, okay, Dr. Stevens, I've been listening to you now for 26 minutes and 11 seconds, and you haven't told me yet, okay, what this poem means. You haven't really come to an understanding of this poem, have you? And I would say, okay, it's true. I have not really come to an understanding. But I think I can explain. One reason I can't come to an understanding is because of that ambiguity. The poem really does not resolve itself. It raises the question of what madness consists of. And it gives us two possibilities. Okay, the discerning eye and the majority. Okay? And then I can say, but wait a minute. It also gives us that irony. The irony that we might think we know what's mad, but we don't really know. Okay? And we need to decide. Okay, how can you decide whether something is mad and whether something is sane? So I can say, well, perhaps that's really the meaning of the poem, just in the irony of the difficulty of discerning. Okay? But it's okay. Ambiguity is all right, because ambiguity really comes down to allowing the meaning of something to be in the lack of decisiveness. Okay? The point here is simply that we can't really say what the true meaning is. Sorry about that. My dog here just woke up from his nap and he's barking out the window. But let's see if we can't. Hey, dog, Schooner, lie down. He sees something out the window, and so he's interrupting my lecture here. Sorry about that. But the point here is simply that ambiguity in itself can be a meaning. The work of literature can simply be inviting us to see the difficulty in understanding what something really is. I want to close with two things. One is the intentional fallacy. Because you might be saying to yourself at this point, okay, Dr. Stevens, look, if we can't figure out what this poem means, why don't we simply ask Emily Dickinson? Okay? The idea being that if we don't know what something means, we can ask the author. What was the author trying to communicate? What was the message? Okay? So we go, okay, we'll ask Emily Dickinson. Yeah, we know that Emily Dickinson is dead, but we can find out things. We can look at her life. We can look at her letters. We can look at her notes. We can talk to her family, her descendants, perhaps. We can investigate public records and so on. All right, and perhaps by consulting that, we might be able to find out what her intention was, the intended meaning. The new critics said no. All right, the meaning has to be inherent in the text itself. You cannot determine what something means by trying to figure out what the author meant it to mean. I bring this up because it is very, very common, especially when you're first starting to read and try to interpret literature, to say that, well, this is what something means. The meaning is whatever the author intended for it to mean. And the new critics say no. The work of literature must stand on its own. We must be able to find the meaning in the work itself and not by consulting what the author intended. And then the last thing is biography. Now, the new critics said no, we cannot interpret a work of literature by consulting the life of the author. And the more we know about the author's life, the more we might be able to understand the work. And you can see that biography obviously is related to this whole idea of authorial intention. All right, we can look at biography and we might be able to figure out what the author meant. So the two go together. And what I'm going to suggest is this. I do agree with the new critics that a work of literature cannot be reduced to what the author meant for that work of literature to mean. All right? But I think that in cases in which we have some difficulty understanding it, perhaps understanding something about the life of the author will shed some light on the meaning of the work, and I'm willing to do that. In Emily Dickinson's case, for example, I'm willing to say, okay, she's talking about sanity, and she's talking about how we can determine whether something is sane or not, and she's offering two ideas. It's the majority or it's the discerning eye, and it sounds as though she's really coming down on the side of the majority, but there's kind of an ironic, even sarcastic tone there, isn't there? Right? Where, it seems as though she's saying, in effect, the discerning eye can really tell, but no, it's really the majority. They're the ones who decide everything, and it really comes down to what's normal, right? So if you think it's not normal to walk down the street with one shoe off, okay, well, then that's it. Then you understand what's sane and what's not sane, right? Because you agree with the majority, and so on. It sounds as though she's coming down on that, and we can detect in the irony, we can detect that note of sarcasm. So we might say, okay, yeah, she's really raising a question about the power of the majority and the way the majority determines the social norms, what is normal behavior, what are normal ideas, and so on. Okay, and I'm going to say, okay, yeah, I think that's consistent with Emily Dickinson's life. Because Emily Dickinson was an eccentric person, meaning her life didn't follow a normal, ordinary pattern. She never got married. She never left the family home. She never had what we would consider to be a normal love life. All right. She did not have a career. She didn't raise a family, and so on. Her life did not follow the normal pattern. All right. So in a lot of ways, Emily Dickinson was not with the majority. Okay. Her life was different from the majority of lives. So I want to suggest that yes, I think that what we know about Emily Dickinson suggests that what this poem really is doing, in spite of that ambiguity, is it's questioning how we understand the nature of madness and how we understand the nature of sanity. So, four things: ambiguity, tension, paradox, and irony. Remember those. Remember the intentional fallacy. Okay, the idea that something means what the author intended it to mean is fallacious or wrong. And remember that whole idea of close reading, paying attention to the details of the text. I hope that you've seen this as an example of close reading. I hope it helps you understand new criticism, and I look forward to the comments that you make online. Thanks for listening.